Today we'll be looking at Daniel chapter 5. We're doing a study in the book of Daniel, and Daniel was a great prophet, and there are more prophecies, more specific and amazing prophecies in the book of Daniel than possibly any other book in the Bible. And so we're going to be going through all of those, and we're just kind of getting into the beginning to get into the deeper water as we go. But in future chapters, we're going to see some amazing prophecies. But let's review just for a moment what we have covered already. We began in the book of Daniel, Daniel chapter 1. Daniel was a young man, and he was among the captives from Jerusalem that were captured by Nebuchadnezzar the king. And he was carried away with he and some of his friends, and they were named Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We've talked about all these characters up till now. So that's 5 main characters that we've looked at so far: Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And we discussed how that the king, Nebuchadnezzar, had a dream. He forgot the dream, and yet the dream troubled him. And he couldn't get a satisfactory answer as to what the dream was. He couldn't recall the dream. He couldn't get his wise men of the kingdom to recall it for him. And so he was angry, and he intended to have them all killed. And Daniel was a young man that was well known among his peers already for being able to interpret dreams. But when it was told him, when he became aware that he was among those that were going to be destroyed because none of the wise men could tell this dream, he said, wait just a minute. He said, let me go before the king. And Daniel went before the king, and he was able to tell the king his dream and to give it an interpretation. Now briefly, let's just talk just a moment about that dream and its interpretation. If you'll recall, it was a image. It was a great image, and it was divided into several different metals. The head was of gold, and the chest and arms were of silver, and the belly and hips area were of brass. The legs were of iron, and the feet were of iron and clay, and the toes as well. And then Daniel went on to tell him that the interpretation meant that these different metals and these different parts of the image represented future kingdoms, except for the head of gold, which was Nebuchadnezzar himself, the one that dreamed the dream. And he said, God is showing you what the future holds. Well, the story we were about to tell today in Daniel chapter 5 is the transference, or the fulfillment of that first transition from the head of gold to the chest and arms of silver. We're going to tell about the fulfillment of that prophecy in this story today. But before we get there, I would just say that a couple of other things happened. And in Daniel chapter 4, the king had another dream. And in this dream, he dreamed that a great tree grew up. And then he called Daniel again in after, of course, once again, visiting with other wise men. Daniel ended up being the one that could tell him what this dream meant. And what this one, the interpretation of that dream, was that the tree was a great tree, and that the tree represented Nebuchadnezzar, and that it would be cut down because of his pride and his inability or unwillingness to make God his object of worship, and he was failing to give God credit. He was proud and lifted up, and we all struggle with that. Pride, according to the Bible, is among the worst, if not the worst sin that there is, to think of yourself higher than you ought to think. And so Nebuchadnezzar ended up getting abased. And as we closed out chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar had announced that he understood that the Most High was the ruler of the world and the universe. And that's the last we have of Nebuchadnezzar. So now we're to chapter 5. And in chapter 5, a new king is mentioned here. So I'm going to read beginning with Daniel chapter 5 and verse number 1. It says, Belshazzar, the king, made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords and drank wine before the 1,000. Now, Belshazzar was, I guess, what you might call a spoiled brat. It doesn't say that, but he was, it's clear in this story that he had not learned the lessons that his grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar, had learned. And he was high and lifted up, and he thought more highly of himself than he should. And he was having this great feast, which obviously there's nothing wrong with having a feast. There's nothing wrong with having a good time. There's nothing wrong with celebrating. But you're going to see that he took it too far. And he crossed a line that God would not allow him to cross. So as he's making this feast, it says, whiles he tasted the wine, he commanded to bring the golden vessels, and the golden and silver vessels, which his father Nebuchadnezzar, and it was actually his grandfather, had taken out of the temple, which was in Jerusalem, and his princes and his wives and his concubines might drink thereof. So he had had a little bit too much to drink, and he was really having a good time. And he decided to have them bring the golden vessels from the house of the Lord to the party, and that they might drink their wine out of these vessels. So they went and got them, and they brought them, and they drank wine out of them. And it says in verse 5, the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, and the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. And the king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosed, and the knees smote against one another. Wow, what a story. So the king was having a good time, and he crossed over a line here. Now, we've already said, having a feast is not a sin, and having a good time is not a sin. And many would argue that having wine is not a sin. And I'm not going to get into that argument at all. I'm just going to say that that's not what he was doing. He was drinking wine in excess. And when you do that, you set yourself up for the opportunity to make bad decisions. And this decision was particularly bad because he lost all reverence for God. Losing reverence for God. You can believe in God and believe that he exists and not have reverence to him and for him. And those are completely two different issues. Believing in God and reverencing God are two completely different things. And he probably believed in God, or at least the supernatural, because he had wise men that advised him. And these wise men were of the type, they were like spiritual advisors, but they were not followers of the God of Israel, the one true God of heaven. So when he stepped over this line by drinking out of the vessels that had been taken from the house of God, a hand appeared and started writing on the wall. And I'm going to read this again, what it says about the king. It says the king's countenance was changed. So he had smiles and laughter, and now his face had a completely different look. And it says his thoughts troubled him. It says so that the joints of his loins were loosed and his knees smote together. Now the joints of his loins, I'm assuming that's his hip joints. And when I read that, the first impression I got is that basically it could mean that he soiled his pants. Now that maybe seem a little crude and a little rude, but that's the insinuation it seems to be making to me. I may be reading a little bit too much into that, but That's how scared he was. It's obvious. He was so disturbed and so frightened that it says that his knees banged against each other. Literally, his knees knocked against each other. That's how frightened he was. So, it says that the king cried aloud. And he said, bring in the astrologers and the Chaldeans and the soothsayers and the wise men of Babylon, that they can read this writing. So he brought them all in, and this is the exact same thing that his father or his grandfather before him had done, is consult with the spiritual advisors when something happened that was beyond his ability to interpret. Now, I want to just talk about that for a few minutes. It's important to live in such a way to where you're in touch with God all the time. It ought not be something strange. It ought not be something you only do when trouble arises or when you've stepped over a line. And Belshazzar is going to find out here that he stepped over a line that he could not undo. He went too far. So anyway, then came in all the king's wise men, and they could not read the writing, nor make known to the king the interpretation. It says, and then was King Belshazzar greatly troubled, and his countenance was changing him, and his lords were astonished. He became so frightened that the people around him had never seen him act like this before. Then it says, now the queen, by reason of the words of the king of the lords, came into the banquet house. She wasn't there. She wasn't at the party. But word got to her that the king was disturbed. Now, you get the impression here that, again, it doesn't say this, but that she may have been his mother or his grandmother. She had been around a while, and you get the impression this was not his wife, because it says his wives and concubines were at the party, and she wasn't, the queen. And she told him, she said, there is a man in thy kingdom in whom the spirit of the holy gods in the days of thy father Nebuchadnezzar had understanding and wisdom. And so she said, there's this guy, his name's Daniel, and he was big man back in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, your grandfather. And it said, he's able to understand dreams and understand hard sentences and dissolve doubts. And so they called him, and he came. Daniel is summoned. Now, Daniel was the kind of guy that Belshazzar would never have invited to a party like this. He would have known better. Have you ever noticed that some parties you go to, there's certain people you would never invite? And you know what I mean. You have your invitation list changes based on what you're planning on happening at the event. Well, this was an event that Daniel was not invited to. And in fact, King Belshazzar didn't even know who Daniel was. He'd never heard of him before. And Daniel was an old man and had been around a long time. And he had never met him. So, but he knows about him now because the queen mentioned him. So in verse 17 it says, in verse 14 it says, he says to Daniel, he said, I have heard of you. Now, he heard of him because the queen had just told him about Daniel. And then he says it again in verse 16, I have heard of thee, that thou can make interpretations and dissolve doubts. And he said, there's this writing on the wall and I need to know what it is. Now, Daniel, when he got there and was told these things and presented himself, he looks up and he sees this handwriting on the wall, and people, by now, the atmosphere of the whole room is dramatically different than it was. There was a big party going on, and now everyone's standing around looking to see what's going to happen next. And a strange quietness has fallen over the room, and all the eyes are on the man of God, Daniel, the prophet, and on the king, who is frightened and asking him questions. And here's what he says to Daniel. If you can interpret this dream He said, you will be clothed with scarlet and have a gold chain put around your neck, and you'll be made third ruler in the kingdom. And Daniel said, King, thy gifts be to thyself, and give thy rewards to another. He said, I don't have any need of your gold chains or your lofty positions or your fancy garments. I have no need for them whatsoever. He said, but I can tell you what the dream says. And then he takes off on a sermon. Now, I remember when my children were young, that if they had done something that they were in trouble for, I would call them I would go into their bedroom and sit down there and have them sit on the bed, and I would start to talk to them about what they had done. And I would give them this sermon, so to speak. And I would tell them that, look, there's nothing in me that wants to punish you in any kind of way. I don't like punishing you. And I would talk to them like this. And my children to this day will tell you that they hated those talks. They hated them. They would rather me just spank them or ground them or whatever I was going to do and just leave out the speech. The speech was heart-rending and they didn't want to hear it. But I believe to this day that it was probably the most beneficial part of the process. It was way more important than the punishment itself. And so that's what Daniel did. And he said, let me just tell you, and he goes through and he gives him a message about how he has uplifted himself and he's exalted himself and he's not paid attention to God. And then he says this, you've not paid any attention, he said, to the lessons that your grandfather Nebuchadnezzar learned. He said, but you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven and have brought vessels of the Lord's house before you and your lords and your wives and your concubines have drunk wine in them, and you've praised other gods of silver and gold and brass and iron. And these things, these gods cannot hear. And there is a God in heaven. And you have not paid attention. And here's what it says about that God. In whose hand thy breath is. Guess who controls your breath? This God does. And so then he looks up the wall and he said, here's the saying and here's the interpretation. And I'm going to read it to you. The handwriting said this, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. I guess I'm pronouncing that correctly. And this is the interpretation. God has numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Thou art weighed in the balances and found wanting. And thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Now the Medes and Persians, of course, were the next kingdom to come in. And as this was being delivered, and as the king was going in and doing what he said he would do, putting the gold chain around his neck and clothing him, and Daniel's just sitting there taking these things. While this is going on, during this whole party, the Medes have been outside the gates of the city. They've dammed up the river, diverted the river, and their armies have already breached by coming underneath the wall. And this young man, this king, I say young man, he's 62 years old. This man's days, this day's hours, this guy's minutes are numbered. And it says in verse 30, in that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain. And Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old, 62 years old. Now, is the handwriting on the wall in America? Have we gone past the point of no return? It does seem that way. It seems like that we've forgotten God completely as a nation. Now, there are a lot of Christians, and I know a lot of very dedicated Christians. But when I see the way we behave ourselves in this time, and the way even we act in most churches compared to even just 15, 20 years ago, it's appalling, the difference when it comes to pure trying to do the will of God and to live holy and to think of God and to put God first and to truly keep our actions and our communications in line with what God wants, we're in a sad state of affairs. And it's not that God cannot change things. It's not that God can, but it doesn't look likely. And I guess it never does look likely. But America is not by any stretch the nation that it used to be. And Darius stepped over the line. And, you know, there's, this can be illustrated. We see this in our lives many times. You see a relationship, and one person in the relationship says, this is not going to work. And the other person doesn't listen. It says, this is not going to work. And time goes by, and finally that person says, that's it. And then that person that has been being warned says, oh no, well, wait, what can I do? And they say, it's too late. There's nothing left. There's nothing you can do. I have a fear that that's where we are in America. I hope that we're not, but I have a fear that that's where we are, that we have stepped over the line, that we've passed the tipping point, and that the handwriting may be on the wall. I hope not. I hope you'll pray for your nation and for me and for yourself, that we will honor the God of Abraham, that will put him first, and that we'll pray that whether or not it's too late for America or not, that we will be ready. I believe he's coming soon. As we get into the rest of the prophecies of Daniel, I believe you'll see very clearly, according to the prophecies of Daniel, that the time is near. It's at the doors. And so stay tuned as we look into these next few chapters. It's going to get exciting, depending on how you see it. If you are ready to meet your Lord, these are going to be exciting prophecies that we're going to look at over the next few weeks. So pay attention, keep listening.